Hello, everyone. Last bit of section of the lecture on the subject of South Africa. Just picking up on some of our discussions previous, but now locating them more centrally to history related to the Republic of South Africa. Okay, so we'll start as we do. We like to sort of look at Europe some here and just sort of get a gauge of what's happening in Europe. And when we think about, maybe sort of what will sort of play out in terms of the Dutch footprint in Africa, it's worth considering that at home, it's a breakdown kind of a thing happening. A federation of states, which included Belgium and Luxembourg and the Netherlands, started to break down, right, and began to break down. 1830, Belgium's out, Luxembourg's out, and so in the end result, of course, is the Dutch Republic, but um, and this sort of separate identity that will emerge. But just that feature of that nationhood and identity and the struggle for that in Europe, playing out in the wake of things like in the Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent Congress of Vienna that will sort of secure a peace in Europe, supposedly for a good portion of the 19th century. This is the idea, with the exception of maybe some small things. Sebastopol in the Ukraine area, one exception. All right, you see me falling into the trap. But nationhood and the battle for nations in Europe is significant during this time. Maybe just keep this in mind as we watch what plays out in Africa here. Um, and if we now zero in on our region, we'll look at it on the map. You got, of course, that pastoralists, the nascent Mashona kingdoms. Those are the echoes of the folks that have worked with me. We talk about Great Zimbabwe and the architecture there. I mean, this predates Cecil Rhodes and his foolishness by millennia. But you think about those kingdoms. You think about Ngoni and Zulu, who we'll talk about quite a bit of the context of this today, and then into this mix comes the Dutch, who are now calling themselves Afrikaner or Boers, as part of a way to reflect their settler culture, but also want to sort of make the case for their indigenousness or connection to this land. And obviously, when you bring into the mix already some tension, right? Because of legacies of slave trading, as well as some of the push-pull stuff going on relative to, you have an Islamic slave trade as well, right? But this sort of conflict, this sort of tension here, is playing out, right? And so you add to that locust, plague, and drought. The 19th century, when the British are, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, they're really going to start making their case along with the Dutch for their need to occupy this region, right? But early on, the Dutch come in a very much in a religious ideology, right? This Ham's curse stuff and this connection to Calvinism maybe shouldn't be should be taken very seriously and critically sort of investigated to some degree, right? Because they will use this to justify. If these people have been banished by God to be lesser people, right? We go to Ham's curse if you want to talk about it. Then the enslavement, the taking of their land, and then the subsequent Dutch notions of republicanism or self-nationhood and identity amidst the British approach to occupation of this land. Because the Dutch and the British are going to fight over their who can fight. I mean, who's going to fight with the other indigenous people over who controls the land? I'm maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but not. I don't know. I wouldn't say. Um, but you've got this sort of strange mix of things, right? And that's why I think it becomes known as the Methkani, the time of troubles, because look at all the chaos that gets stirred up here, right? And then amidst this sort of stuff, the Dutch further establishing an identity, right? Moving to the interior state. They call it essentially a promised land, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, something called the Great Trek. I mean, and it's a harrowing journey. And if you look at it maybe from the perception of these Europeans in this land, they're trying to establish and carve and establish themselves. And no, nobody wants them there, right? but they believe it's theirs by God, and the connections, promised land. If you start thinking about promised land in the way in which manifest destiny might have worked in the 19th century, right around this time, and the Americas relative to the native peoples, there's some very interesting correlations at work. And obviously, there would be because these are both, even though it's in a latent phase, and you talk about a settled population in America that grows up to be the United States, they're latent British. I mean, if you want to get funny about it, it's sort of British post-colonial peoples here. These are colonial settlers here. Obviously, that's very accurate, I think. And the way they're going to interplay with the native groups is going to be funny. So it's going to play out here. Yeah, settler populations are different, but the presumption of expansion and the occupation of people's land based on things like a promised land notion or a manifest destiny notion, the correlations we'll see some other, right? So we make the people work for us in consideration of allowing them to live in our country. That about sounds about like something coming out of the sort of early settlers in North America relative to their interrelationship with the native, right? But even that presumption is off because if you think about those moments there, right, where the sustenance and the viability of the Dutch being able to survive in South Africa is based in large part on the ability of the natives to help them, right? Not all of it is violence and frustration against the native groups. In some instances, the native groups are the ones who are going to help to support them, so they're sustainable, just like the native groups do here. So this idea of them creating their own nation, this is a sort of modern assumption that within these states there weren't ideas of nation at work already. One, two, that's yours by God-given right, by right of civilization, by right of modern manhood, or what have you, to take and occupy this land, right? Yeah, throughout the period after the Great Trek, the Matabele people repelled the Dutch, the Voortrekkers as they became known, right? They definitely repelled and resisted their incursions, right? But as I mentioned, the British are in the game, right? And they see, in part, South Africa as part of their own sort of imperial expansion. Remember, Dinka Cecil Rhodes, as we talked about before. He had this idea of territory extending from Alexandria all the way to Johannesburg, right? Pretoria, right? He already had the idea of a foothold all the way striding across Africa, right? Some of the imagery that evokes that sort of notion really puts it in place, right? So the British had their own aims, and they're going to come against now the Dutch, or these aka Afrikaners, right? And of course, those imperial visions, run smack dab with the Swazi and the Ngoni Zulu people who are also in this area and are not, just sort of saying, ready to lie down and allow, these people to roll over, right? In fact, the Swazi people actually do some good, to good effect, put down the Dutch, right? But resist the British incursions. Afrikaners defeated by the Swazi, but resist the British incursions, right? And the end results of some of that are the taxation tensions that will come into play, issues of representation, and then the British within this space, right? They're kind of feeling like, I'm sorry, the Boers within this space are kind of feeling like they're being controlled, right? And they see the British authority and even the ideas of British control here as maybe something that, maybe the American settlers would sort of see, and they would view the arbitrary hand of the British in their colonial affairs, right? And how they treat their slaves, how they interact with the native peoples, right? This sort of thing. And so because of this, there's going to be tension between these folks, right? Over how they're going to engage with the local people, right? And ultimately, though, the Boer and the British agree, right, after some initial fighting, right, to using something in the Pretoria Convention of 1881, right, is the parameters of an agreement. And another feature of what's at work here is, right, is that first, the Africans have been sort of coming back strong, have begun to come back strong. We'll talk about that in a second. Have shown that they're not laying down, right, in very real ways, right? And then also two, Witwatersrand gold deposit discovery. The game has switched up. The whole process has switched up, or maybe I should say ramped up, right? Especially on the part of the Dutch and on the part of the British, because diamonds are far away in terms of discovery. The game now, I mean, it's just like it's a freeze moment, right? You know, I mean, you know, think about our history. You think about the 49ers, and California and the gold rush and those kinds of things that led to some real sort of gold fever. You could sort of mushroom that by a little bit. You could sort of factor that by two, three, maybe four, right? In terms of how this discovery of diamonds and golds are going to play down here in this region of Southern Africa, right? Um, so one of the things that the British strategically do to maintain an authority, although they will allow this Boer republic to take shape, they can't, in the context of their own notions of, political economy, essentially, the capitalist or liberal democracy. They can't deny the sort of Dutch Republic in that way. I think that's got to play in terms of the decision making, right? Maybe if you cut it down to the members of parliament and what they're going to sort of chop out and ultimately agree to, maybe that sort of issue of politics plays less. But I think it's at work there. I would be careful to sort of make that the center of it, but it's a feature there, right? But one of the things the British do is they can just they just say, okay, well, you guys shape this thing out. But in terms of external relationships, in other words, with some of the native peoples primarily, but also too relative to the rest of the world in the foreign space, that really plays out later on down the road in the 20th century. So the British are going to be the sort of authority. They're going to make the final call in terms of their relationship on in the external affairs. So they're going to agree to this, right? And not shortly thereafter is the founding of the British South African Company in 1889, and then just to give you an idea of British expansion that's going to take place, I'm just showing you by 1891, Matabeleland, Mashonaland, and Buchanaland are all declared British protectorates. So the British are definitely expanding. And even though, so this strategy of external authority, you can see how it's going to play. Because basically they can surround the new emerging Dutch Republic with British protectorates, essentially, right? But if we back up 10 years back, right, to the moments not long after the first Boer War, right? If we just back up just a minute there, right? Remember we said there were some things that were happening. There were some reminders that things could get funny. That the Zulu, among other groups as well, were not just going to lie down, right? You get this interesting sort of depiction or account from one of the British commanders, because they're scouting the Zulu, and these are the beginnings of the Anglo-Zulu wars, right? Which are going to pit these two against each other, and in many ways, it's the British sort of laying down the gauntlet relative to things that have happened in the first Anglo-Boer War, and saying, okay, now based on these sorts of issues, here's our plan. From this point on, we're going to move forward and occupy territory. The claiming of these protectorates is dislocating, folks. The creation of these protectorates is dislocating people, right? And so now you've got the warriors on the prowl. If you know the whole history of Shaka Zulu, I don't have to evoke the legacy of that much here. Just have to talk some about sort of the style, the nature of what it was that the Zulu warriors were able to do in general, right? And so, you got your British scouts out looking, and then one of them records, then in astonishment, he stared into the ravine itself, right? Closely packed and sitting in utter silence, covering the floor of the ravine and perched on the steeply rising side stretched as far as the eye could see. In both directions were over 20,000 Zulu warriors, right? So and this is after the British had gave them this ultimatum, said, okay, now we're going to walk into your land. Now, from this point on, we're coming in and we're occupying. And the Zulu were like, they have been resistant to that, right? So then, the war is on. And this isn't the first battle, but this is one of these key battles here, right? And you know, the British soldiers were not prepared for what they thought they were prepared. You know, even the day of, there's a great scene I think in the Zulu film that I make reference to, and sometimes in very problematic ways, where they're all sitting down eating breakfast, talking and stuff, and all of a sudden, I mean, they can hear the boom boom in the background and stuff, and people, you know, just it's starting to because they're trying to shoot as much as they can against these warriors who are starting to you know, come out, and they're led by the 70-year-old army commander of the MP, and they come out in a real you know, powerful show of you know, first they just come. I think actually, you know, because there have been history in the incursions that they wouldn't send out all these people to go fight. You wouldn't see battles 20,000, 25,000 people engaged in battle, right? Essentially, they were just there as a show of force. Sometimes, you know, maybe 100 or 200 men would fight, right? 1,000 men would fight, maybe in a real, you know, pitched battle, maybe more, you know, could be a show of force. I mean, think of a psychological impact of that. You've got maybe, you know, 5,000 good warriors, Shaka Zulu or some other commander, one of these others like Kamahole, right? 70 years old, flank out 20,000 on you, you're gonna give them up to ghosts, you know. So even though the British had Martini Henry rifles, remember those are the ones that King Loban Gula so got 500 of, so that Cecil Rhodes could come in there and do his thing with the gold, right? 1884, that's a little bit later, right? So the British Army has these guns, and this is what they're going to use to try to fight. But so they say they couldn't reach the guns in time. And then they had all these other guns. They had some big cannons there, right? Big cannons, other type of weapons. They could throw out some real firepower at this army, but they couldn't. They couldn't stop them. And by the time they got these guns loaded, could start shooting this stuff off and trying to repel them. That army was moving so fast. You know, they show how they just come across the side of this sort of this ridge or what have you, and they just come out. They just pour out. It's been one, right? And then you got all the smoke in the air, so nobody can really see anything. So they tore them up. And then on top of that, you have about if I'm not incorrect, you have at least a 50 or 60% recorded eclipse that occurred on this date, January, I believe January 22nd, 1879, right? And one Zulu account says the sun turned black in the middle of the battle. We could still see it over us, or should have thought we had been fighting to evening, right? So if they couldn't, I mean, they could see part of the sun. So otherwise, they were like, man, we've been at this all day. But that was like almost like foreshadowing because they essentially were at it all day, right? And the warriors, you know, had these very real war rituals, right? Part of which included an ingestion of a sort of a cannabis substance that gave them a little bit of you know, psychological energy. You got the spiritual piece going on, and they were in there just tearing people up. I mean, against the guns. And the guns, they thought the guns of those who used them were weak because with their weapon, this ascension, but that's actually the wrong word that describes it in the correct in the language, and we'll show that word in class. You know, they were tearing them up. So you know, they would mutilate the enemy after. You know, again, it's reminiscent of things like a Little Bighorn and other instances where you had the arrogance of folks with their weapons and their cannons who had, in many instances, won the day. But in one or two of those key engagements, and I mean the ones that will turn the tide of things, they get caught in the mess, right? And people try to play it down, right? British took away guns, they took away artillery, they left hundreds of British soldiers dead on the field that day, right? But what the legacy of this will do is take you to Works Drift. And Works Drift by itself is something because you have this fledgling British army who hold out the last little bastion of their army encampment there, right? Against the Zulu raids, right? So a dispatchment of the warriors, and some even say they were the other sort of like the ones who didn't always fight, the reserves essentially sitting back. Those are the ones that they sent in these raids against Warwick's Drift or this last British encampment, to which the British held out for all the way due to until the next day. Right? They did, right? But at no point did the entire 20,000 Zulu warriors attack after not after it not after the first is and wow is and wow now. I can't say y'all see me breaking it up, right? But not after that first sort of engagement. After that, they had already won the day. The battle was over, right? And they were coming back and see like. But if you watch Zulu, they only the way look at the way they depict it. It's funny. I mean, we'll talk about it in class. But anyway, this is an important event that gets unrecognized in the context of what happens here, right? And why is it important? Because it reminds you of something. Zulu and the Soto kingdoms were contending political economies to the white dominated capitalist societies that were emerging in what I mean is an emerging Dutch republic and a new British protectorate, where they had strong relations with some of the local chiefs. They had bought out Cecil Rhodes, okay, but not everybody was all the way bought in, right? And so you could see systems and states that were saying no. In the very end, they still fought, right? And even after 1880, even after things like what happened at Works Drift, you still have real evidence of pre-colonial systems and state ideas, right? That remain, of course they do, right? But things like the Rudd Concession of 1889, right? And even negative responses to that, because people didn't all fall in line with that, as you could about imagine. They felt like the king had betrayed them, right? And then ultimately it will lead to the Matabele Wars, right? All of this reminds you that this is just people were just not acquiescent to the sort of British colonial machine or the Dutch for that matter, right? And so what I call the Matabele Wars, really, which would sort of bring us 1893 to 1897, are really sort of the end result of things like the Rudd Concession and continued resistance to efforts by the Dutch and the British to expand, right? And one involves, in 1893, the Ngoni and Zulu massacre of Mashona people, right? I remember, and Mashona land, remember the British protectorate, right? So then the British are justified to come in there with the moral protectorism of the Maxim gun. If you ever seen that thing in action, it's a pretty ugly machine. They can justify this, but the Matabele and other people respond to those incursions, right? And then so they took and hid rifles. They if I'm not mistaken, they grabbed and captured one of those Gatling guns. They were used to in incursions and in resistances, such as one known as the Big Dance, right, which involved frontal attacks and continued guerrilla incursions and resistances, right. And if I fast forward or over sort of simplify this between 1890 and 1913, right, a series of peace treaties and annexations, the feature of the Maxim gun becomes a feature, a fabric of this, the violence that it will bring, the way it's taking people apart. No, the Zulu mentality against going up against it and saying we could take it down, and not only that, we can grab one and steal one of our own and put it against them. We can continue to fight. Does not die. It's just I mean, you think about that though. The violence in the wake. Somebody in there gets in there and says, "Okay, you know what? This is enough." I mean, even if this whatever this means, this is enough, right? But resistance continues, regardless of that. So it's not necessarily something that everybody says, "Okay, we're all going to work together," right? But really, what's at work here, if I could stress, is the gold and the diamonds now, because now you're offering people wages. You can bring people in the sort of migrant labor system into these sort of metropole sort of centers of colony in South Africa, right? And this is beginning to shape. This is starting to take shape. People will take a wage over fighting, for sure. But the tension between the Dutch and the British is still going to play out. And in 1899, it does, right? And that's where, again, you see Cecil Rhodes in place, sort of engaged in this sort of problematic political machinations, geopolitics, you want to call it that, right? Among other things, there's already a tension between the Anglos and the Boers, the Uitlander, right? The white outsider who agitated against the indigenous Afrikaner. Now you see this thing playing out. People are drawing identities from these. let me be clear. Settler populations of European descent are drawing out African identities, right? For whatever you may take that to be, right? It's the reality of this, right? And something like this shows us at work. Outland, them you from outside. So here we are as colonists, but it's no different to what the U.S. does with the native peoples here. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, it's kind of problematic, but it's true. It's very real. But anyway, there's that tension between these two groups in South Africa. And so Cecil Rhodes, as a British operative, let's call him that, or his agents, let's say, get involved. You under or behind, or with the blessing of the British South African Company, let's say it that way, right? Tried to do something called the Jameson Raid in 1895, right? Where they're gonna try to stage a rebellion, bust out against the Transvaal New Dutch Republic government, and take power essentially, right? But the British caught, I mean, the Boer Dutch caught them where they could lay them down. They had the high ground, and they just put the snipers on them, and that kind of was the thing that could win the day, right? But then the result of that too resulted in a formal declaration of war against the British. Their success initially with the German arms, but it won't be long before you have, essentially what some would describe as the British War Imperial War machine sort of picking up steam. It just took a while to get the right troops over there, and so by the time the things end, they show up with upwards of 500,000 troops, if my numbers are correct there, right? And what do? I mean, that's when you march in and start telling people, okay, the war's over. You got snipers here. Okay, we're gonna blow you out of this thing. We'll blow you out of here. You want to go get into the place where you want to fight? Because we're gonna set up shop. We're gonna fight you. We're gonna starve you. We're gonna fight you all day, and then you're gonna give up. You're gonna give up. Then you might have had a chance as scouts against a small, set of soldiers coming from the company, and there may be some other representatives of emerging British presence there in terms of military, but you didn't have many. But once the call got out, hey, people start showing up. Now you're gonna have to deal with it. And see, they started rounding people up. They start putting people into what many would call POWs for one of the first times. We're talking about other Europeans, right, who have settled on African land, right, and some 30,000 died. And the Boers continue to fight like this sort of war against these violences, right? So you can imagine the narrative that is now created, right? And then in truth, there was rape, starvation, and other horrible things going on in the camps. But so though the Boers now lose on this ground at the Second Boer War in 1899, they've gained the moral high ground because the British look bad in the way in which they've engaged in the taking and the winning of this war, right? But one of the things that follows is the Union of South Africa. And yes, I moved up a little bit from 1900 to 1909. There's some other things that will occur between those dates, right? But the Union of 1909, right? Really sort of carves out something that already had been in work, right? Which was essentially the British will sort of control things foreign, and the Dutch will keep an eye on domestic things, right? And so for the Dutch, that meant they could engage right into sort of direct policy of what would become known as apartheid, right? It essentially ensured the segregation and domination of indigenous populations by rights, right? It's Afrikaans word for partness, right? It meant things like the Native Land Act of 1913, the Pass Laws of 1923. It also signaled the emergence in 1911 of the African National Congress, right? Forget all the past differences among Africans, unite in one national organization. So now that the Zulu and the Matabele and the Mashona may now be sort of on different sides relative to their interaction with the Dutch and the English, right now, forget all that. We got to reunify in terms of a system to resist what is happening. And apartheid is the nastiest of them all, right? In terms of the system that has real resonance because it will last up until 1994 before it lets go. It's the last one where Jesus is late. It's 80, but I mean 14 more years until apartheid will end. And part of the history of this is very well known. So this is another reason why we'd have to really, really draw out all the bits and pieces of this. Some of our documents will sort of help us shine some lights on some of what will happen. But um, in the decades to follow, I mean, you see a system, a bureaucracy emerge around the maintenance of a system of apartheid, right? Things like the Native Administration Act, right, which says, okay, although they're distinct ethnic identities, we're going to call everybody Bantu, I think is the name they began to use, right? And then no one could vote. And then on top of that, indigenous South Africans that own 13% of local land. And of course, that has a lot to do with the fact that the gold and diamonds are here. So much wealth is being created that there's sort of internal colonialism emerges, right? And some people will equivocate that to the intersection of northern and northeastern finance and the development of the West in the 19th century America. Here we go back to this 19th century dynamic that compares the emergences of the South African Republic to elements of, Americanist expansion in North America here, right? But there's still the states that sort of state interaction. We're talking about South Africa that can now intersect with and finance Rhodesia's white settler population, right? Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique can have a footprint and a hand there, one that we can play into the politics of the post-apartheid era, for sure, right? But prior to World War I, I mean, you talk about a very strong and organized, structured system of apartheid, of segregation, right? Stronger than the ones here in the United States, and stronger than the Jim Crow stuff here in the United States. Jim Crow pales in comparison to some degrees relative to that of apartheid, because you talk about here one that is not municipal and perhaps state based, but federal, right? That changes the whole thing. That means you can operate from the federal level and operate and interact and set out this system of separateness to enforce and other things, right? It gives you state power, infrastructure to do this. That's, I mean, and the fact that you still have resistances in light of that, it's no surprise, but the dynamism of the resistance is worth noting, right? So even as the National Party strengthens, ANC kind of in hand grows, and so do other forms of resistances. But the ANC is the central 100,000 people, right? And all the time in step apartheid legislation, even after the end of the war begins to go. Because remember, the Germans had already had a sort of relationship with the Dutch during the Anglo-Boer War, and believing the ideas of Germany seeking to expand based on the notion of its own superiority throughout the globe was one that was recognizable to Werner Herzog. And I mean, I'm not Werner Herzog is the director, JBM Herzog and the National Party, right? They knew that stuff, right? But you had the ANC. It was growing just in step, right? And that's why they had to shut Mandela up and prohibit him from speaking in between 1953 and 61, right? That's why you had things like the Sharpeville Massacre, right? Which was essentially people were protesting the pass laws, which were these books. They said everybody had to have a book. You had to have all your, you talk about us with identification. You had to have this with you, and if you didn't, man, we may not see you again. We may not see you again. Right? And yeah, the same. Unfortunately, we can relate to this kind of thing in our own experiences, right? We can relate to the relevance of this, the potential of this, right? This is where the frustration and these kinds of things come in. And the radicalism, right, will start to really emerge. ANC, the PAC will break away to Pan-African Congress because they don't think the African National Congress is doing what they need to do. And the PAC becomes a sort of political and militarized wing of the ANC to some degree, right? Both of them are banned in 1960. In 1963, Mandela and 8 leaders are sentenced to imprisonment for treason amidst issues around the Rivonia trial in 1963. We'll look at some clips and evidences of that. That really puts him away for almost a quarter of a century, 25 years almost. I mean, he's almost away. I mean, what I'm talking about, 25 years, about 28, 29 years, right? He's incarcerated, right? And they don't kill him, right? And why? Because he becomes a martyr. By this time, you get real fervor, right? This is where you have people like Mama Makeda singing about the issues of apartheid and bringing it to the whole world, right? Through her relationship with Harry Belafonte, right? They start telling this story. This gets out. This kind of thing. This is why in '66 the UN declares apartheid a crime against humanity. Right, the word is getting out, and by '69, some of the events and the South Africa Student Organization, right, this sort of youth groundswell is starting to also even sort of shape and push and encourage the efforts and sustain the efforts of the ANC, right? They organized things like the dock worker strikes in Durban, right? And then, but the state's coming back. The State Security Council. I mean, this is people start disappearing. Biko's killed. I mean, he's killed in police captivity, right? That's a regular occurrence, right? There are real dislocations in our experience, and I don't like the whole notion of comparing trauma, but one can take some looks here and draw some very important sort of correlations, right? Kids killed in 1976, hundreds of kids killed in 1976. What was their protest? Well, look at the kids. This is the picture of the kids, damn, who made you bring this up that? Look at the picture of the face of the kids. Anybody in there look like they're about to start shooting and firing out guns? What are they saying? We do not want Afrikaans. What is Afrikaans? We do not want we don't want to learn this bullshit history. I'm sorry. We talk about Calvinist, Ham's curse, downplaying, stereotyping, Bantu cultural appropriational apartheid, blah blah blah. Bullshit is a good word, right? And then you think about what they did to these kids who all came to protest, right? And then they literally shot these kids, and many of them had injuries in the back, right? It's one of the worst. I mean, this again, it's just people just at odds about this, right? I mean, the value of I mean, there are other ways to get at this. I would just mention that the CBMI collection here at our college houses a collection of materials. We'll look at some of it. We have time in class that remind us of even how people in Chicago was like, man, we can't stand for this. This, I mean, come on, this is too much, right? Yeah, as I mentioned, Steve Biko's killed in detention. Um, and one thing though, let me back up here because I didn't mention I skipped over '74, and I skipped over the overthrow of the military coup that overthrows Portuguese colonialist dictatorship in Angola. Remember, we were talking about that just in the week prior. Just talking about that a week prior, and how this will play into the end of apartheid. In the film, this gets more clearly unpacked, and we'll have a link to that for you to take a look at it. But this is a very important sort of issue, right? Remember, it's Cubans that are going to come over here and help this overthrow of the Portuguese, right? And the Americans also end up in this, so you can see the sort of the machinations of communism versus save the world against the communist threat, sort of east-west dynamic taking shape. You end up this sort of bipolar, a culmination, if you will, in many ways of the bipolar tensions, especially relative to the third world. Right, this is a big one. Right, what plays out here? Because the end result, apartheid will end. Right, but the writing was on the wall to some degree. Zimbabwe is independence in 1980. More and more increased awareness of the violences that were being inflicted upon just people who were just political activists and organizers, passive resistors, writers, thinkers who just did not agree with the system and would resist the system to their death. And many of them died as martyrs resisting this system. And more the world started taking note and started saying, okay, you know what, we got it. You can't. This is where Coke ran into a real problem. It's Coca-Cola ran into a real problem because they were obviously not really paying close attention to this issue of whether or not they should have funds in South Africa. People start saying, you know what, if you do, we're not going to be drinking this no more. This is going to be the end of it, right? And these kinds of issues start playing out, right? Even cheesy, even Hollywood. You think about like the Lethal Weapon 2. It's a cheesy movie, but Danny Glover now is a political activist in part for the ways in which he brought that issue of South Africa and apartheid to a public space. I mean, they're both. I like Danny Glover a lot better than maybe Mel Gibson, but I mean, those clips in the '80s. I mean, you could, if you knew the culture of the time, it captured the imagination of folks. And people actually paid attention to this. This was on the sitcoms. Everywhere you look, you could find out about this, and people took and championed this cause. It was silent. Reagan. Now, don't get me wrong. Reagan and Margaret Thatcher didn't have that much to say. All right, I'm getting into the deepness of this, but there was real. There was an awareness. It was political action and really organized grassroots activism that brought us to awareness. But Desmond Tutu, uh, uh, you know, um, winning the Nobel Peace Prize, and then a secret repeal of the past laws and the Mixed Marriages Act of 1986. These is in the wake of decisions on the tensions relative to the end of the Angola War, which you'll see in the doc. And then also, withdraw South African troops from Angola. I'm sorry, I'm just saying Angola, the Cuban victory. Then the clerk, takes charge of the National Party and starts even further working more and more in quiet with Mandela. Right? They're like, okay, we're gonna figure out how to do this, right? Repeal of apartheid legislation, and then two massacres that hinted one inflicted by whites against blacks, and then one by blacks against whites and everybody. I mean, just all this sort of the tension of the moment sort of erupted, right? And it reminded everybody that, if we don't get this right, it's about to get bogus in here, and potentially we could go the way of something like Zimbabwe or one of these other states, but maybe that's not what we want. Right? So it took a real consensus effort on the part of the population. I think people have to take their hat off to the population who acquiesced to this, right? And agreed to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1996 that was designated with the task of resolving, engaging with these issues of all the political violences and this, the way the security police were snatching people off the street, whole families, waves of people killed and murdered, subjugation of people economically to the degree that, the highest rank that folks could get was maybe to work in the mines. Mine jobs were great jobs, like political jobs, research jobs, jobs as faculty, jobs in colleges and institutions, jobs as business people beyond menial tasks. So you need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to deal with this. This is what, after Mandela becomes president in '94, is created, right? But things just didn't, didn't after '94, right? Mm, things just got tough, you know. After 25 years in power, the African National Congress draws intense criticism from South Africa's persistent poverty, inequality, violence, health crisis, and corruption. Right? So now the party who saved and was at the forefront of resisting apartheid throughout the up and through the post World War II era. Well, I'm saying World War I, 1911 it was founded, right? Has now become a dinosaur and maybe a big, fat whale that's sucking up a lot of the political, economic, and maybe social power, right? Especially of the moment, right? So, like in the moment at the end in '94 and all these things, you have real capital, but how was that used? And this is what has been a critique, largely from the mouth of the West. But I think too, if you ask people locally, I won't say I think too for sure, there's going to be some frustration, right? Jacob Zuma, he's just involved with it. You could do, maybe we'll look at some clips of him. You could do a separate documentary on his foolishness because he's engaged in all form of disrepute relative to his position. And ultimately resigns as the head of the ANC and, president of South Africa. He has to resign. Disregard for the rule of law and an inclination to treat government offices as platforms of self-enrichment. No doubt about it, right? But what is also true is that the ANC and the collapse of the ANC in many ways and the loss of maybe some of that political authority, not completely, has given way to newer alternative voices, right? And Cyril Ramaphosa, who is now, who was a big, ANC person, Mandela's heir apparent, some have called him, right? Um, uh, um, in many ways, though, it's still just ANC sort of post-apartheid elite, right? And has been characterized as a strike buster. But the very least, though, some things came out of this, right? At the very least, this was a peaceful transfer, right? What could have taken shape in terms of guns and violence, this involved people publicly finding and identifying a leader who wasn't good and who was corrupt, ejecting him and now putting someone else in power, and closely watching what he does next, right? But for things like the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that was initiated at the end in '96, right, that had all these bright ideas. And I've spoken quite highly of it myself in terms of maybe this might be the sort of model you want to think around in terms of dealing with things like police justice in a very wide and real way, because you can see that in our current experience, it's a regular occasion. It's systemic, right? It doesn't have the same preference of a federalist system that could outroll and mushroom that level of violence maybe to a factor of two, right? That'll tell you what you're working with, right? If you think about what this apartheid government was able to do. But it's still one that's very, very real and visceral in the legacy and memory and history of this country. So a Truth and Reconciliation Commission makes sense, but it's got to be the right kind, right? And this is, I think, some of the challenges that came with the apartheid Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? Because although it could bring people to task for individual crimes, never bring anyone from, right? The broader societal and structural systems of apartheid, such as keeping people, only job you can do is work in the mines. Only job you can do is work as a maid, or essentially a houseboy. That's it. That's as far as you can go. That's systemic dispossession. That still hasn't been dealt with because it still exists today. Maybe the racism is gone, even though you still have inferences of it and legacies of it, right? It's gone in terms of its federal sort of system, federal support, but the legacy of it is there, right? Because you talk about people who still don't have access to education, inequality, violence, health crisis, all these things remain as real challenges, right? But you got sort of, and this is maybe sort of a thing that could be at work, historical amnesia and cynicism amid ideations of justice and real reform, right? So that's maybe what South Africa sort of is in terms of thinking about where it's going to head for the future. So we'll spend some time unpacking some of these subjects further in class.